Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president here at CSIS, and I have a wonderful opportunity this afternoon to talk about a topic that touches every American in countless ways every day, and that is the future of our energy economy. The purpose of today is to talk about a report that was issued by a special commission. My colleagues here in this conversation were the co-chairs and one of the leading members of the commission, and that was a commission on nuclear energy and climate security. And this was a report that was done last fall. It was issued in December, and we're going to explore all of the dimensions of this new report today, and I'm really grateful that my colleagues are here to share it with us. So with us is Dan Poneman. He was the Deputy Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration. Dan Brouillette, who was Secretary of Energy in the first Trump administration, and Sherri Goodman, who has been in, I think, 3 or 4 major jobs, all associated with energy and the environment. And we're delighted to have all 3 of you here. So let me begin. Dan and Sherri, you were the co-chairs of this commission. For our audience, how did this come about, and what were you trying to accomplish?
Well, thank you very much, John, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you and all of our panelists. And allow me to start by first correcting the record that the title of the report is Nuclear Energy and American Leadership. And that really underscores what we're about. And we brought this commission together through a fellow think tank called the Council on Strategic Risks, that's a smaller think tank that focuses on strategic risks, including nuclear. And we were very focused on how to revitalize America's nuclear industry, because it's been an important part of our baseload reliable energy for decades, and it's an important part of how we compete internationally in the growing civilian nuclear energy market. And we wanted to ensure that America heard from leading voices in national security, in energy, military leaders, and others to understand the importance of emphasizing and furthering American leadership on nuclear energy. So that's how the commission was born. We are very grateful that you and Dan Brouillette and Dan Poneman, my co-chair, and others like Susan Eisenhower and Admiral Richardson, former Chief of Naval Operations, were willing to serve on this commission.
I might just add, that's exactly right, and Sherri gets full marks for setting this thing up, inviting me to co-chair with her. She mentioned some of the great bipartisan membership we had in the commission. We had former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. We had the head of the building trades, Sean McGarvey. We thought it was very important because any policy to succeed in nuclear space has to have broad bipartisan consensus. And the other thing lurking, frankly, beneath this commission and the need to reassert American leadership, as the name implies, is we lost it. Over a number of decades, through misadventures, mishaps, the United States, which basically invented this technology and once dominated not only in terms of our nuclear deterrent that defends our freedom and deters our adversaries, but commercially, globally, we were the dominant player in reactors, we were the dominant player in fuel, and that's not just a commercial thing. If you care about things like non-proliferation, the United States had a critical leadership role in setting the non-proliferation norms for the whole world through partnerships with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And if we are to see nuclear take the role that I think everyone expects to see, with now many countries calling for a tripling of nuclear power in the years ahead, we have to want the best safety standards, the best non-proliferation standards, and that's why American leadership is important.
You know, when you invited me, I held off until I learned that Dan Brouillette was going to be on the commission. I thought, well, if he's going to be on this commission, that's something I think I ought to do. Dan, why did you join the commission? This was interesting.
Well, I agree with both Sherri and Dan. I mean, it's important that the United States reestablish our leadership in this field, and they touched on a number of different areas here. Obviously, national security, the mentioning of a CNO, Admiral Richardson, I think indicates the importance of this technology to our military, our Navy, and our Air Force in particular. And then there are the environmental concerns that we all have as well. So I mean, the notion that we can meet our environmental goals, be it the 2030 goal, a 2035 goal, or a 2050 goal, whatever it is, without nuclear power just seems to me to be far-fetched. So I thought that, you know, we need to do something as a group, as a, you know, an organization, as thought leaders, to revitalize this industry. And, you know, I'm proud of the record that these two co-chairs have established, not only within this commission, but clearly in their former roles. I'll tell you just a quick story. Dan came to me when I was the Deputy Secretary of Energy, and he pointed out a problem that we had here in the United States with the creation of a specialized fuel for these advanced reactors, high-assay LEU. We had lost our ability to enrich those types of fuels here in the United States. And he says, we have to bring this home. We have to get this back. And I was fortunate enough just to stand on his shoulders as a Deputy Secretary and reestablish some of that capability here in the United States. Again, to meet our national security goals, but to also meet our environmental goals, and dare I say, to meet our economic goals, as we think about the onslaught of demand that is coming not only from the remanufacturing capabilities and activity that we see here in the United States, but, you know, the things that we read about in the paper, artificial intelligence, data centers, the amount of load that is presenting to our U.S. Grid is incredible. And if we're going to meet that challenge as well, then I think nuclear power has to be part of our portfolio.
You've just given a wonderful summary of what I'd like to cover today. Let me again, I just want to anchor our audience around the commission report. Sherri, you brought expertise in climate change. Dan, you brought expertise in nuclear energy. Well, let me ask each of you to kind of give us a flavor for the primary recommendations that you brought forward in this report.
Well, I'd say first and foremost is the need for the United States to recapture American leadership in the growing civilian nuclear energy market. I mean, we have long been leaders with about 100, large nuclear power plants in the United States, but we haven't built very many in recent decades, and we've kind of lost control leadership on the nuclear supply chain. High-assay enriched uranium. And so we need to wrest control back from our adversaries that are producing it today. And so that's the importance also to underscore the need for nonproliferation and safety. As more and more countries bring on nuclear power plants, both large baseload reactors and the new generation of small modular and micro reactors, it's very important that the U.S. is in that mix and not ceding control to Russia, China, or adversaries who don't have those same concerns for nonproliferation, safety, and also for the economic opportunities it presents to the United States market.
Dan?
I want to add to that. Sadly, after 3 Mile Island in 1979, we had 3 decades of not building new reactors, and our supply chain basically atrophied, our workforce atrophied. So now for new companies to get into the game, every time there are first-of-a-kind challenges that lead to delays and costs. So one thing that we propose is cost overrun insurance for the first movers to get us back in the game. That's one thing. Secondly, and Dan is as usual too generous in his praise, Dan Brouillette deserves enormous credit for seeing the critical problem of the United States falling out of the uranium enrichment, the most critical aspect of the fuel cycle. Russia has 44% of the world's capacity, and until Dan took his actions, the only source of high-assay, low-enriched uranium needed by these advanced generation reactors. So we have to now build on that beachhead that Dan Brouillette created when he was in energy. And the Congress, in a bipartisan way, 96-3 vote in the U.S. Senate for nuclear fuel security. Then they appropriated $3.4 billion. We should build a plant. There's only 4 enrichers in the world, Russia, China, and 2 state-owned enterprises in Europe. The United States should never have fallen out of this. That's a second recommendation. And to Dan's earlier point about the Navy, it's not just for the commercial sector. We need that enriched uranium to support our deterrent. We need tritium to be produced for our actual weapons, and we need naval reactor fuel in the long term to supply our submarines and our carriers. That's the second thing. Third, we've got to be out there, to Sherri's point, we've got to be out there marketing and selling. We've held ourselves aloof for too long we should be going around the world, and we've got the best wares, we've got the best technology. We should have an ambitious program, and all the other governments are putting all kinds of export support, and we need to make sure that the Export-Import Bank and the Development Finance Corporation are fully funded. And the last thing I'll say, and this is again to echo and footstomp Sherri's point, we have to be more lean and mean on our regulation. We need very good, safe regulations, but it's very important the NRC recently modified its mandate pursuant to a very important piece of legislation called the Advance Act, that they are not only responsible for regulating the safety, but enabling the deployment of this advanced nuclear, which is critical to our future.
You know, the report is structured in terms of recommendations. Day one recommendation, first 100 days, and then the first year. Do you want to summarize basically the thrust of that?
Well, it was with malice aforethought, I would say, and Sherri's may have a different take. FDR did a lot of good in 100 days. And I think all of us, we've got probably among the four of us, a couple centuries of experience in government. The first few months of any administration are when you have the greatest ability to get stuff done. And so we had these metered out in an earlier draft over, you know, more separate timelines. We said, let's try to get what we can get done in that first 100 days, and then check in a year out and see how we've done.
President Trump recently created this national commission or national council on energy dominance and first 100 days. As a matter of fact, it talks about pushing the executive branch to respond in 100 days. Dan, you now have a larger portfolio than just nuclear, though I know that you continue to have an interest in it. What can you tell us about where things are going in the Trump administration?
Well, I think, you know, as you might expect in a new administration, there's a lot of sorting out to do, staffing up of agencies, establishing clearly what the president's policies are. Some of that we know now. They're still in that process, though. But we're approaching that 100-day mark, so we'll be anxious to see what they actually do. What I'm excited about is not only the structure, but the players that are going to be part of this structure. If you don't know Chris Wright, he has a very interesting background. He comes at this first as an electrical engineer. I graduated from MIT. He understands electricity very, very well. And he has a long and deep history, not only in the oilfield services industry, which he is very well known for from his founding and leadership at Liberty Energy. He's actually a very large player in wind energy, and not many people know that. But his first love was fusion energy. That's why he went to MIT. He thought he was going to be a nuclear engineer. And he's very, very passionate about it. And up until the day he was confirmed, he served on the board of Oklo, which is a small advanced reactor company out west, along with Sam Altman. So he has a great portfolio, great background, and on a personal level, he has an intellectual curiosity that's just insatiable. So I'm very excited about his leadership of the department and where he's going to take it. If I were to guess, and this is just a guess, but an educated one based on the conversations I've had with him, nuclear is going to be at the top of his list of things to do. And I think, you know, when you think about what the department is and what it is not, it is a department of science. So we think about it, you know, in research and development terms. And as Dan pointed out, and Sherri's pointed out a number of times, you know, the demand for electricity is very high, so nuclear is going to be part of that, but this is a dual-use technology, so we have to be very careful with it. Non-proliferation is very important. So where does the Department of Energy fit into that? Well, there's non-pro programs within NNSA and whatnot, but there's also research and development on advanced fuels for these reactors. And as we continue to develop accident-tolerant or more accident-tolerant fuels, and fuels that are not able to be used as warheads, we can see this industry being catalyzed, I think, in my lifetime. So I think, you know, consumer acceptance goes up if the department can continue that type of research and development and help bring those technologies to bear in the marketplace, bring them to commercial fruition. And I think that's where Chris is going to be. And I think as Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, chairs this new commission, you'll see a lot of focus, not just on oil and gas, but on nuclear technologies as well.
I read the executive order this morning, and the only energy source really called out in the executive order is really about pipelines for natural gas. It doesn't speak to the range of energy sources. Dan, how do you feel they're going to look at these issues? Obviously, when they say they want to be energy dominant, that means drilling and pumping and getting energy into the system. How do you think that things like nuclear fit in that? I mean, is it a second priority, third priority? Is it going to be, do you think it'll come up higher? How do you feel about it?
I think it's going to come up higher. I think that if I had to, and again, I'm speculating a little bit. I mean,
sure.
Somewhat of an educated guess, but nonetheless, I can't speak for the president any longer, so I want to be careful about that. My instinct is that they're going to focus on the problems that are here and now, the ones that they can help solve today. And the one that we can help solve today is to meet the electricity demand that we talked about. And the way you can do that is in the near term, displacing heavier hydrocarbons with things like natural gas. That reduces our emissions profile, but it also provides the baseload power that we need to service the AI demand and the data center demand that is oncoming. Longer term, I see nuclear being a strong number 2 and moving up that list. And it's simply because of the density of the power that it provides.
Right.
It's just so much more dense than anything that we've ever experienced here.
Right.
So I think that's where the administration's focus is. Our challenge in America, you mentioned energy dominance being about production. It is to a point, but we know how to produce molecules here, and we know how to produce electrons. Our challenge over the last few years is actually moving those products to the marketplace. We don't have enough pipeline capacity. We don't have enough transmission capacity for electrons. So that's why the president's executive order, in my opinion, is probably focused on those near-term issues, but nuclear is going to be a growing priority for him.
If I may add to that, Dan's absolutely right. There are a couple of factors that are bullish on why this could be, and I think should be, successful this time. Electricity demand in this country for many, many years has been flat, okay? Last couple of decades. Now, we've talked about it a couple times in this conversation, the AI revolution is here, it's real. I've talked to utility executives, they're talking about adding like tens of gigawatts. That's like 10 nuclear power plants, big ones, in the next decade. We're talking about electricity for AI and data centers going from 3 or 4% of total U.S. electricity demand to 10 or 12% by 2030. So that's huge, and there's no way, as one of our colleagues, Ernie Moniz, would say, it's not math, it's arithmetic. There's no way to meet that without everything you can throw at this problem, including nuclear. That's the first thing. The second thing is, one of the challenges is, when you don't do something for a long time, it gets expensive and slow because you get rusty. So the last big plants completed in this country, Project Vogtle, cost $35 billion. That's a lot of money, and it was well over budget. And when you think of a U.S. utility that's got a market cap of $40 or $50 billion, that's a pretty hard decision to make for a long-term project. But now, all of the hyperscalers, who are the ones who need these electrons for AI and for data centers, each of them has a market cap of $1 trillion or more. All of the investor-owned utilities in the United States together have a market cap of $1 trillion. So now all of a sudden you have both balance sheet that's adequate to the task and a demand signal that's requiring of the electrons. So I think this, combined with what Dan said, really set us up potentially for a very successful effort.
I agree. And Dan, just to put some of those numbers that you just articulated very well in context, for our audience perhaps. Everyone's heard the word gigawatt, but not many people know what a gigawatt actually is or how much electricity that is. If you think about a city like New York City, it's roughly about 6 gigawatts a day. That's about what the city uses. Now, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission tells us that even without all of this AI demand, just the normal pattern, going from 2% to perhaps 30%, we're going to be about 25 gigawatts short by 2030. So what they're saying in effect is you're going to have to build about 4 to 5 New York-size grids in 5 years. That's the acute challenge that we have, and I think that's why the president's order is focused on infrastructure initially, but we're going to have to build more generation to get those electrons. And that's, I think, going to be a larger and larger priority, not only for this administration, but any successor administration as well.
I thought gigahertz was a French car rental company. So, I'm not the person to talk technical things, but that was really helpful, the way that you framed it, Dan. Let me ask this question. I looked at the executive order, and it seems to me a great issue inside of it is, how do we move forward on permitting with such a fractured energy environment? You were Secretary of Energy, Deputy Secretary of Energy. That gives the impression you control things, but the energy market is fractured, So what are your thoughts about how we can get a more rational energy investment plan? And I'm going to use the word, preemption, federal preemption. Yeah. I'd like you to talk about that.
Well, I think there's a lot of work that can be done to streamline the permitting process. We've read stories about NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act. It's a very important law. I don't think anyone is suggesting that it goes away. But we can do things within the executive branches, perhaps, to streamline those processes around NEPA, around the development of environmental impact statements. A very simple concept. I know both the Biden administration, I know we did some of this work as well. Do you need 2 or 3 agencies to provide you with environmental impact statements or to do NEPA assessments? Or can we rely upon perhaps the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or the EPA to provide you with a NEPA assessment or an impact statement? And then from that point on, every successive agency that has to review your permit can rely on that instead of doing its own, which is which is time consuming, I should say, and costly. Those are some simple steps I think we can take without degrading or in any way diminishing our concern about environmental stewardship. So, it's things like that I think we need to look at as an administration, look at as a U.S. government, look at as a country.
They sometimes say common sense is not so common. So when I, first day on the job at the Energy Department, somebody said, think about what you want to get done now because the clock is ticking. There was a lot of concern even then about an accretive approach to nuclear safety. Every time an incident happened, they would add a regulation. They would not necessarily do a deep dive on what went wrong. They would just say, well, something happened, let's write it. And so you ended up, I actually had them bring into my conference room, your old conference room, the regulations, and you couldn't get a person sitting in there. And I don't believe it's true that more paper means more safety. So you can be smart and get people who are not just looking at clipboards and checklists, but looking at what's happening in the system and get a more robust safety culture and a better safety result by being smart. So I think that sometimes there's a mistake to think more red tape means more safety. It's not true. That's the kind of permitting reform we need. And let's face it, if we're going to meet any of these demand signals in a timely fashion, we're going to have to get more efficient. That's why I'm very hopeful that this new mandate at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which was required by law to enable the deployment of these important technologies, really leads to a cultural shift inside the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Okay, I completely endorse what you guys have said, and I think it's right. But we have a very fractured energy market. It isn't just the federal level. It isn't just NEPA having a bunch of excess requirements. We've got state regulators, we've got regional grids, it's a very fractured environment. Can we get to a more rational system with the current fractured structure we have? Are we going to have to make a change? Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot.
I think there are going to have to be some marginal changes, yes. Everyone respects states' rights and the importance of that, within the context of our Constitution and founding of our country. But there are national priorities and there are critical infrastructures that we need to protect, and there is a national security element to everything that we're talking about today. And I think at some point we're going to have to acknowledge that. AI is a very important technology, not only for our economic activities here in the United States, but also our national security. If we think that is true, and if we believe that as a country, And I think we're going to take some steps to perhaps preempt at the margins some of the things that we think about. The development of a transmission grid or a transmission system that can move an electron from LA to New York or New York to San Diego. Those are the things we have to think about as a country. And I think as we do that, we're probably going to come to the conclusion that energy security is national security, and some of these things are going to have to be built.
If I could add, to that, because I've long believed that energy security is national security, and if I could make an analogy from our time in the Pentagon together in the 90s, John, we were closing a lot of military bases, and the president at the time, President Clinton, wanted us to fast-track cleanup, okay? It wasn't nuclear, but there were a lot of hazardous and some radioactive waste. We had to figure out how to meet the president's goals working with EPA and state regulators, and that took some reform of how NEPA applied in the Department of Defense, and it also required us to work with federal and state regulators to enable them to work concurrently rather than sequentially with us so that we could do things on a faster time frame. And because there was a demand to return those properties to communities, we had a demand signal. Now, it's a little different, but today we have, as both Dan and Dan have said, we've got an enormous demand signal for electricity, for energy, not only because Americans want more energy, but also because of the hyperscalers and AI. And they're leading the battlefield on this in many ways, and they've got the capital to put down to sort of help grow that market. But at the same time, I think there's now a bipartisan basis of consensus that we need to reform the way we do permitting, but we can do so in a way that still assures safety for Americans.
Yeah, we do have a very strong consumer demand right now. So let's think about this, what you just said about the hyperscalers. When you think about electricity in particular, I don't think anybody goes to the grocery store to buy an electron. That's not what the consumers want. What consumers want are their lights to come on, they want their air conditioning to work, they want their heat to work. What they also want in this environment is for their Amazon Prime to show up the next day. And all of these technologies depend upon AI at this point in time, and they depend upon these data centers. So our ability to meet that demand is absolutely important from a consumer standpoint. And I think we're starting to see that now in the marketplace. That's why the hyperscalers are really stepping up, as you said earlier, Dan. They see this as well, and they want to meet that demand. It's not about just simply creating electrons for the purpose of creating electrons.
Yeah.
Right, and they're already making deals to restart 3 Mile Island and
That's right.
other, and help catalyze the nuclear industry.
That's exactly right.
But I want to sort of underline the real challenge, John, that I think is implicit in your question. When you think back in the early 50s, when we had the National Highway Act and President Eisenhower was able to put in the whole interstate highways, which was an incredible engine of growth and efficiency, and it was sold as a national security thing. This is like the opposite of what we have in the electricity markets, right? Nobody in their right mind would invent a system like what we have, which is some regulated, some unregulated, some regional transmission authorities, some independent system operators, 3 separate interconnects, balancing authorities. It is nuts. And then, of course, you have federal, state, and local, and everybody's got to get into the act, as Jimmy Durante used to say. So this is no mean feat to do. It's essential, but I think it's incumbent on us to realize the scale of this challenge if we want to sort of get past all of that, and everybody's got to vote and everybody's got a stake, and they're going to be very reluctant to give that up. We're going to have to somehow work our way through that.
Right. I mean, I remind my friends, it was John D. Rockefeller who lobbied to create the Federal Trade Commission, because he was seeing all of the regional, the state regulation of the oil and gas industry, and he said, I can't live with 30 different rules. I need a single rule. We need a national standard. And it was John D. Rockefeller that pushed to create the Federal Trade Commission. We're going to have to do something, I think, because we have too fractured an energy market, an electricity energy market. It's as you said.
That's exactly right.
I looked at, we've got 6 big grids, in America. But I've looked at the East Coast grids, and they're coming very close to what's called the reference margin. you know, that these grids, the reference margin is 15% above the hot day, you know, so that you can move electricity around a grid. We're coming within that limit now on all of the grids on the East Coast. I mean, east of the Mississippi River. So doesn't it seem that we have to really lean in on this, Dan?
I don't disagree with that. No, we do.
Yeah.
I think, you know, it's a very acute problem, as I said earlier. And, you know, right at the moment, you know, your point is a good one, and Dan's point is a good one. I mean, we do have a fractured market, especially on the electricity side. Oil and gas side, you know, we can debate. You know, we have pads and we have different fuel standards for different parts of the country, you know, because of air quality control and whatnot, and you know, requirements under the Clean Air Act. But I think the electricity markets in particular are in need of desperate reform. That's where I think the biggest challenge for us as a country lies. So, you know, I don't have a perfect answer. I don't know that anyone does right now. But
This is tough politics.
It is tough politics, but the importance of commissions like this one and thought leaders like these two scholars next to me is that we have to start that conversation.
Right.
And we have to do it today.
Right. I'd like to just shift and talk a little bit about, I mean, nuclear power. I mean, I am shocked every day. I read something that I just say, wow. And today, what shocked me was Abilene Christian University wants to build its own nuclear reactor. Okay. That's good. I have no idea if Abilene Christian University has a nuclear energy program or not, but it is that level of excitement around the country about people wanting to start nuclear. Dan, I mean.
Well, I have never, in the 50 years I've been working in this field, seen more intellectual ferment than I see today. And without getting, I don't know that particular case, but there was, under Dan's leadership, the Advanced Reactor Development Program. And by the way, we talk about governments being slow. If my memory serves, between the enactment of that legislation and the contract awards was 10 months. We can do things fast when it's important. That program supported 10 reactor designs. We have a whole new wave of advanced reactors. Some of them are basically miniature versions of the one we've already known and built. They're so-called light water reactors. This would be like GE and NuScale and Holtec. And then there's a whole new set of what's called fourth generation, which don't use light water technology like the familiar technology we've seen, but will use other kinds of coolants like liquid metal, like molten salt, like gas. And the advantage of these is because metal does not melt at as low a temperature as water, the problem of evaporation of water, uncovering a core, meltdown goes away. You have what they call inherently safe designs. Or if you have a high temperature gas cooled reactor like X Energy, they have very high outlet temperature. So now we can actually use nuclear steam not just to make electrons, but to support industrial processes. And we all know that electricity generation only comprises like 1/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions. So when you want to decarbonize the rest of the economy, things like that become very important. But to your point, the implicit point is we got to make sure we still do it smart. And in calling for lean regulations, it doesn't mean calling for no regulations. And I think a combination of the requirements that the NRC imposes on the seriousness of a project, and then frankly, the seriousness of investors who are going to have to write big checks to support them, provides some, if you will, guardrails that would prevent this from getting too far out of hand. I think we need a few designs. I don't think we need hundreds of designs to get built.
You know, the other notable news event of today in the nuclear world is that the new German government, led by CDU, Christian Democratic Union leader Merz, may be interested in reopening some of Germany's mothballed nuclear plants. Now, that would be a real change because Germany has been one major European economy that went anti-nuclear after Fukushima, and that has meant that their reliance on coal has actually increased. So for them to reconsider and move back towards where France has, substantial reliance on nuclear energy, would mean a whole, first of all, a whole new market opportunity that the U.S. should be right there to help them with through, as Dan said, the Exim Bank or the Development Finance Corporation. And we should see this as, a turning point because, as we noted, at the climate conference in Dubai a year and a half ago, dozens of countries, including the United States, committed to triple their deployment of nuclear energy by 2050. And while we're a long way from meeting that commitment, we want to make sure that the U.S. is a leader in helping to meet that.
I want to come back to, did you want to jump in on that?
This is, I think Sherri just raised a really important point. We've been talking domestically. What Sherri just said is incredibly important because starting with the invasion of Ukraine, the whole, if you will, zeitgeist, as I say in Germany, around nuclear in Europe has changed. All of Central Europe wants a lot of nuclear, not just for energy, but they don't want to be dependent on Russian natural gas imports the way they were. You see, the Dutch have now gone back to nuclear. The Swedes have stopped turning off nuclear. The Belgians, the Spanish parliament, they were very negative up until lately. Now they're talking about going back to nuclear. The Italians, Romania. In fact, and so now I think, whole momentum in Europe is much more favorable than nuclear. And I was spending a week in Germany last year on this very topic. And I tell you what I found, which was in all the conversations, of which I had dozens, there was like a bell curve. The people, if I may say, my age, whose anti-nuclearism goes back to nuclear weapons issues and arms control from the 80s, you'll never turn. Most people had a kind of view that it's kind of like Brexit, maybe it was a bad idea, but it's too late. But the young people are very interested. And now, as Sherri said, in the recent election outcome, they may have a champion in the chancellor.
I want to come back to this international dimension, but before we get there, let me just ask, we've got all of these nuclear things popping up every day. There's something every place. It's just really astounding. But in your report, you talk about needing to create a structure, a regulatory structure, and an insurance structure, a first mover incentives, things of this nature. Do you want to say a bit about that? Do we have the policy framework in place to support this broad, curious expansion of nuclear?
I would say to a limited degree we already have it. And it's been proved to work, and it is the existing, which Dan has administered, the loan program. I'll give you an example that's not nuclear. In 2009, we had the Recovery Act, gave a lot of money, like $30 billion to the loan program. There were exactly zero grid-level solar photovoltaic plants at utility scale in the United States. We had solved technical risks. We had not solved market risks. So the cheap credit, with the full faith and credit of the United States, provided loans that gave confidence to investors to start those projects. The first 5 were financed by the federal government support, with government support, and then the market took over. So that structure already exists. There's legislation more recently that's been introduced that would have, in addition, cost overrun insurance to benefit first movers. So the private sector can and should bear a substantial portion of the risk, but when there's something like this, which has a national security imperative behind it, this is why governments have been constituted, is to take that first mover risk and absorb it across the body politic so we can actually get advanced in our whole energy policy. And it worked, to give you another example that's not nuclear, in natural gas space, when nobody was interested in natural gas because of the prices being so low. The Department of Energy invested, I think, what was it, Dan, $130 million in horizontal drilling techniques and characterization of the asset. That gave rise to the whole shale gas revolution. Yeah. So this is why governments exist, and I think they can play that role for nuclear.
And in addition, the Department of Defense has helped make some of those first mover opportunities and is now doing the same in nuclear energy. It has already committed to deploy a small modular reactor at an Air Force at a base in Alaska, and it's looking at other opportunities as well, partly because of energy needs for mission critical infrastructure on military bases. They need to be able to operate 14 days without the grid, without power from the grid. And so nuclear energy is just a perfect solution for that. And so I think the Department of Defense is looking widely at how it can do this, and by being the first deployer for some of those new advanced nuclear technologies, it can help with provide some of that market demand.
It creates supply chains.
One of the most important pieces of legislation that undergirded our nuclear build-out was the Price-Anderson Act. And it was the Price-Anderson Act that established legal liability dimensions, so that you could take on a big project, but the government would support it. It just seems to me we're going to have to go back and look at Price-Anderson and say, how does that get adapted now when we have this new interest in build-out? Much smaller reactors, safer reactors, but it still is the foundation for our system. Dan, let me ask you about this. How do we, America, encourage other countries to develop nuclear, but in a way that's safe for the world? Every commercial nuclear power program is at some point the foundation of a weapons program. That's how they grew. So what do you think we should be doing as a leader of the international energy community?
Well, I think it's helping develop those technologies that we mentioned earlier. These different types of fuel that are perhaps more accident tolerant than what we've enjoyed in the past. Looking at the non-proliferation effects of uranium, looking at how can we create fuel sources that can no longer be used as a warhead, these dual-use technologies. I think that's where our leadership here in the United States, in my view, stands head and shoulders above the rest of the world. The 17 national laboratories that comprise part of the U.S. Department of Energy are in fact crown jewels, and they can help lead this effort. And I think, as we think about where we started this conversation, that is part of the conversation when we say things like energy dominance. It's developing that technology and making it available to the rest of the world. That's part of that definition. It is not simply about drill, baby, drill. And I think, as I think about the department that we served in, and clearly the DoD as well as part of this, they're unmatched in our capabilities, absolutely unmatched. So I'm excited about the future for this technology.
May I just add, this is really important. Russia just announced that their order book for nuclear power reactors globally is $200 billion. After the U.S. companies finished the plants they built in China a few years ago, the U.S. order book is zero. And as we say in non-proliferation, no exports, no influence.
Yep.
The United States has the finest non-proliferation standards in the world. And if we cede the market to the very aggressive actions of countries like Russia and China, which view these correctly as 100-year relationships they're establishing through these nuclear exports, we're not going to have the kind of influence over non-proliferation that we traditionally did have, and the world will be at a much greater risk point than we otherwise would be.
Okay, Dan, I'm going to ask an awkward question, because when you were Secretary of Defense, you were looking at a 1, 2, 3 agreement in Middle East, and you were criticized for not having the gold standard, but having the bronze standard.
Yeah.
I thought it was cheap and unfair.
It was cheap and unfair. Let me say this.
Why don't you explain what this is for our viewers?
Okay. It's not gold and it's not standard. The United States had, through the Non-Proliferation Act of 1978, the highest standards in the world for non-proliferation. We spent 20 years, I was part of that, to get those standards adopted by all the suppliers on export controls, on dual-use controls. Then we did a deal with the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates, before we did the deal with them, had done their own homework. They wrote a white paper and they said, we don't want to make people in our neighborhood nervous, so we are not going to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium, which could create bombs. They put that into their own law. And then, in my view, foolishly, the United States sort of decided, well, that's a good idea. Let's call it a gold standard and then say it was our idea that we shoved down their throats, which meant nobody would ever do it again. And so what we've done is, at a time when, as I said, our order book is zero, we now had, for some period of time, running around the world saying, I'm not going to deal with you unless you sign this standard that no other country on the face of the earth is even asking for. And this is how we're going to get our influence back. It was a foolish idea. It never should have been adopted to begin with. And now I think the real gold standard, to be very candid, is a standard that through painful negotiations we succeeded in getting all of the suppliers to sign up to several years ago, and then going out and supplementing that standard with the great offerings we have in technology supported by Exim Bank and other things, so we can start to get back the leadership that we lost, which takes us really back to this whole reason for this report. We need to regain U.S. nuclear leadership for our own energy security, for nonproliferation, for national security, for global interest, and for American jobs and prosperity.
Yep.
There's a piece of this I just want to underscore, and it's Dan's last point, because it's also about jobs for Americans. And that's why we had Sean McGarvey, head of the building trades union, on the commission report, because you need a trained and skilled workforce to build these nuclear power plants and to be part of the next generation of the nuclear industry. And we have lost some of that talent in the decades that we have not been leading here. But we have an opportunity to create really good, high-paying jobs for American workers. So that has to be part of the effort as well, to create the education and training and also the job opportunities throughout the building trades that would enable this.
But I think over the last 10 years, there have been 29 nuclear reactor projects started around the world, and America's been involved in only 2 of them. It's been China, it's been Russia.
That's why we need a combination of the demand that's coming today from, the hyperscalers, from, the Meta and Microsoft and Google, who want to build, over the next decade, new nuclear, plus the ability to sell to our allies and partners. We have deals underway in Poland and in Romania and in other countries, and we need to keep that going.
I don't think, I come from a security community. I don't think my friends in the security community realize that the core of nonproliferation is the commercial nuclear energy dimension. It is having a partnership with commercial nuclear energy that creates the architecture of nonproliferation. We need to promote nuclear power because it is the best guarantee we have of understanding what illicit activity is going on in the world. And this is where we've lost this. And so I hope that, Sherri, you're one of the leaders in this community. You need to speak out on this for us.
Well, that's why we're here with you today.
Okay, we're almost at the end of the hour. We've got about 4 minutes left. Let me just ask. I mean, this is an important report. It, in some sense, has been superseded by the administration's new direction, but it doesn't invalidate what you guys were doing. Share, kind of your concluding thoughts about how we should think about this key question of nuclear energy, energy security, and climate. Sherri. Let's start with you.
Well, I think as far as the new administration is concerned, they have the ability to carry this ball much further down the field. They're building on a base of bipartisan support already that we've developed. They're willing, to break through a lot of other challenges that have been hard to do in terms of the domestic market. But I also think that it's important to recognize, as I've said now a number of times, the role of the U.S. in leading this market internationally, because otherwise our security is going to be undermined if Russia and China are the lead suppliers. That's what keeps me up at night, is their lack of safety and nonproliferation standards as more and more countries are going for nuclear energy for their energy future.
Yeah. Dan Poneman, and I'm going to give the benediction to Brother Brouillette.
Well, I will build on what Sherri said. We've had a number of state visits, and the joint statements between the President and Mr. Modi and Prime Minister Shiba referenced the importance of cooperating in nuclear energy. I'm thinking that this is a unique moment where between our capabilities and the global situation and the demand for this critical energy source, we are positioned for a wave of success that could actually propel us back to the global leadership the United States once enjoyed unchallenged and now is in a position to regain. And I think I don't know of any more important challenges. And to Sherri's point, it's not just about the national security and nonproliferation, important though that is, it's about American jobs and American prosperity.
Dan, you
Well
have
said.
the benediction.
Well said. I don't know that I can add anything to what my two co-chairs have just shared with the audience. Perhaps maybe just to thank you both for your decades of leadership in this area. It has been truly transformational, and I think we're at a point in our nation's history where we have an opportunity that I perhaps haven't seen in my lifetime. So thank you both for your leadership. And John, thank you for your leadership here. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you. Thanks for all the good work that you do here and all the good work that's done at CSIS. Very, very important conversations that we've had today and the ones we're going to have in the future.
Thank you, all three of you. I mean, this has been really fun to talk with you. I mean, I don't have an opportunity to have a conversation of this sophistication so much, and it's been really rich. I do think at its core is, any nation's economic security depends on its energy economy. We just have to have that going forward. And we're at a point in time when we're rediscovering nuclear. It is going to be an ineluctable element about our shared future. And we need to manage it not just for our economic security, but for our more transactional national security. And so the three of you have been pioneers to deal with that. So thank you. Dan, thank you for your comment. Dan, thank you. And Sherri, I must say, I really want to say you guys did a great job to pull this commission together, and I was honored. I only joined because Dan Brouillette was going to be on. That's why.
That's a good reason.
Thank you both for being on. That means a lot.
So thank you. Colleagues, please look at our website. There's a lot more material there, and we hope that you'll take a look at it soon. Thank you.